Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's National Careers Week webinar with our focus on psychology. It's been the last of a nice week of webinars, and we've heard from lots of different lecturers, and today we are joined by Rachel, who is one of our lecturers in psychology, who's going to be talking to you a little bit about her career, a little about the course at LSBU, and then a little bit about careers that you can go into in psychology. So hopefully it'll be really helpful for you on the call. So we're looking to perhaps pursue psychology or consider careers in psychology in the future. We do have the Q&A function open today. So what I really like people in the chat to do is to pop any questions throughout the presentation today for Rachel in there. And at the end, what we'll do is we'll pick those up and give you a chance to get some answers to any questions that you have. And what I will say just before we get started is that we have our open day coming up. So if you like what you hear today or you want to find out more about psychology or just LSBU in general, please do come along on the 26th of March. It's from 10 to 3 at our Southwark campus. And you can register for that on the website, which is www.lsbu.ac.uk. So what we'll do is we'll give people maybe a couple more seconds just to get settled and get joined, and then we'll hand over to Rachel to get started with today's session. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll get started very shortly. Okay, Rachel, are we good?
Yeah, we're good. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Amazing. I'm just going to start my slideshow. Just give me a second. Just a sec. Okay. With sound. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. It's over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Just being a bit. There we go. Okay, thanks for joining me. Thank you for being interested in psychology. And I'm going to tell you about my career as an academic psychologist, and I'll tell you my journey, which will be different from every single other person's journey, but I can only tell you mine. And then at the end, we can have some questions. You can let me know what your goals are and what you'd like to do. So to start off with, I'm Dr Rachel Elward. The doctor means that I have a PhD in psychology, and I work at London South Bank University in the Division of Psychology, and I consider myself to be a cognitive neuroscientist and neuropsychologist, which is an aspect of psychology that's particularly interested in the brain, how activity in the brain is linked to our behaviors, our thoughts and our feelings. And neuropsychology refers to how people behave or feel when there's been damage to some part of the brain. So usually from a traumatic injury, gunshot wound, asphyxiation. There's various ways that can happen that lead to noticeable changes in behavior. So I also like to study patients that have this kind of issue. So how did I get here? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you about my career as a cognitive neuroscientist, neuropsychologist. I'm going to tell you then about my move to London South Bank and what I'm doing now, what we've got going on here, and then we'll talk more about careers at the end. So, beginnings. My beginning is not a stereotypical academic's beginning. When you think of a research scientist, doctor, professor, somebody sitting in a lab, you probably don't imagine someone like me. So I had a bit of a, I don't even think it was that much of a difficult childhood, but looking back, on paper, I was not predicted to go on to get a PhD. So the first thing, I was pregnant when I was 16. I had my son when I was 17. At times when we were young, we were homeless. We moved between different housing a lot. We sometimes lived in a women's aid refuge. It says refuse. That means bin. I mean a refuge, a place where you stay when you don't have anywhere else to live. At home, my family had some drug and addiction problems, alcohol addiction in particular. And a lot of mental health problems. My mother's got bipolar disorder, my brother's got anxiety disorders and panic disorder. As a result of all of this, we didn't attend school that much. I went to school a few days a week. So on paper, very much not likely to end up as a professor of anything or a doctor of anything. But I had a lot going for me. I had a lot of positives in my life. Having my son at that age really motivated me to get focused. So I didn't go to school very much, but soon as I got pregnant, I was like scared. I was like, I need to work, I need to try, because I don't know what my life's going to be like. But the main thing I consider to have really put me on this path is I almost accidentally bought this book called Mapping the Mind by Rita Carter around the time my son was born. And I only bought it because there was a special offer where you could buy 3 books for £1 and £1 each. And I knew what 2 of them were, and I couldn't decide on the third one. So I just bought this one. And this book completely changed my life. It's all about neuropsychology. It's the thing I do now. And from reading that book, I was like, I want to study the brain. I want to understand how the brain links to mental experiences. How it feels to hold my son is linked to some activity in my brain. This is insane. I want to study this for the rest of my life. And I looked into it, and there were various grants. I could get a childcare bursary. I was going to be poor, but I'd always been poor, so it didn't really put me off. And I was just determined this is what I wanted to do. And I worked hard on my A levels. I got really good grades, and then I went to university to study psychology. Oh yeah, I thought I'd tell you some of the things in that book that made me excited about the brain. So this is the homunculus. I can't see the chat, but if anyone knows what this is, you could just type it in if you've heard of this before. So the homunculus kind of means little man. And the idea is that we know there's a bit of our brain called the motor cortex, and it's like where my headset is, like if you wear a headband, it goes between your ears and across your head. And it's a strip of cortex on both sides that is linked to your body. It like maps your body out. And when there's activity in that brain region, you're moving or thinking about or activating a part of your body. And they noticed by doing these studies that it's like topographically mapped. So on the inside of it, right in the middle of your brain, the bit of brain there is active for your toes and your knee, and then your hip, and then your trunk. And they also notice that there's much larger bits of brain dedicated to your hands, which makes sense because you need to use your hands a lot and do fine motor movements with your hands that you don't need to do with your back and your legs. And your mouth and tongue also, a lot of your brain, of that motor cortex strip, is dedicated to your mouth. Because again, you need fine movements, and a lot of attention needs to be paid to what's happening in your mouth. If you get a little piece of food stuck between your teeth, you're very aware of it. You've got a lot of brain dedicated to that. So they mapped it out and said, so this is what your brain must think that you look like, because you've got massive hands and a massive mouth and small legs and a small back. So that's the homunculus in your brain. These things just completely fascinated me. There was also a lot of stories of what's called split brain patients. Now, split brain patients, so your brain's got 2 halves, which are pretty symmetrical, and there's a bridge between them called the corpus callosum. And split brain patients, for some reason or other, have had to have that corpus callosum severed. Often it's because of epilepsy, which is so strong, causing such awful seizures, and it's not being controlled by medicine, that they decide the best thing to do is to split the corpus callosum, so at least the disease could only stay on one side. The seizures won't pass across and get both hemispheres of the brain. And there's other kinds of neurodegenerative disease that couldn't be prevented by splitting the corpus callosum. So what these patients told us is when you do that, you kind of make 2 separate brains in the head. And the left side of the brain is the side that's good at language. So if you present a word, like here the word ball, into the left visual field, it goes to the right side of the brain. There's no language in the right side of the brain. So if you ask this man, what does the word say? He'll say, well, I don't see anything, because the language part of his brain doesn't know it's a ball. But the other side of his brain does know it's a ball. The right side does know it's a ball, and he can pick it up. He can say, oh, it's one of these, and pick up the ball with his hand, because his hand knows it's a ball, even though the language parts of his brain don't. And there's been some wonderful split brain studies where, so some people do have a little bit of language on the right hemisphere of their brain, and they ask different questions to the different hemispheres. And they ask the left hemisphere if this person, what career they'd like to have, and he writes down an accountant. But the other hand, which is the other hemisphere of the brain, wrote race car driver. So there's like a silent person in the brain that really wanted to be a race car driver, but didn't have access to speech. So these things just blew my mind, and I found them really interesting. Another interesting example is called aphasia. This is fluent aphasia. I'm going to play you a video. This man has damage to this part of his cortex, which is called the vernix area, and he has vernix aphasia, which is fluent aphasia. So he can speak, but all the words are in the wrong place, and they don't mean anything. He's not using the right words at the right time. So often when people have aphasia, they can't speak at all, but he has fluent aphasia. He speaks fluently, it just doesn't mean anything. Can you hear this?
It's not actually picking up sound, Rachel, as it was earlier. So unfortunately, I don't think we're able to hear that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe when I pressed share this time, I didn't add computer sound. Oh, that's a shame. It's a really nice video. Should I stop and reshare or should I just move on?
And it might be something that we can perhaps send round,
Yeah,
perhaps later if you've got the
exactly.
link, so I can email that out. That's no problem.
It's not crucial, but he's an example, an interesting case of he's a really nice man. He's talking very fluently and he's saying lovely things. He keeps saying happy and holding hands, but he's just not saying the right words at the right time. So because of the damage that he's got to this area of his brain. So inspired by that book, I was very determined that I needed to have a career looking at the brain, studying the brain. I didn't want to be a clinician. I didn't want to be a doctor. I thought that was too much responsibility and I found that a bit off-putting, but I definitely wanted to study it. So I went and did an undergraduate degree in psychology. I did my degree at Cardiff University. And as part of that degree, I got a chance to take a placement year, and I went to Cambridge to the Medical Research Council's Cognition and Brain Sciences unit, where I got to do a lot more research in brain imaging, and I met my first patients, neuropsychological patients. And after my degree, I went on to do a PhD. I went right into it. I didn't take any time off. I was like, that's what I want to do. And lucky for me, the university that I was in built a brain imaging centre while I was studying for my undergraduate degree. So I was the first PhD student in the door when they were ready to take PhD students on. And then I did EEG studies. So what you have at the top here is an EEG cap that's able to measure electrical activity, which is naturally occurring in this person's brain and can be recorded from the scalp. And we can use that to infer the brain processes that are going on underneath. And there's another thing called magnetoencephalography, which is exactly the same, but it measures magnetic potentials instead of electrical potentials. It's a much bigger, more expensive piece of kit, but it gives you more information. I also used MEG as well. And I study learning and memory. So my special area of interest really is how the brain learns, how we remember our past and when that goes wrong. So in older age, people often get forgetful, and there are some memory disorders linked to brain damage as well. So while I was at Cardiff University, I wanted to be involved with everything. So I took part as a participant in lots of research studies just to get lots of different experience. This is me here lying on the bed, about to go into the MRI scanner. I don't know how many MRI scans I've had in my lifetime, but it's definitely a lot. And what happens is you go in there, it's quite noisy, it's quite cramped. And the first time you go in is quite, and I found it kind of spooky, like uncomfortable and strange, but I've been in there so many times now, it's like second nature to me, it's fine. But it is quite cramped, and they give you a little mirror and you can look into the mirror and see behind you, and then they can present experiments, show you stimuli, you can hold buttons in your fingers so you can press the buttons to respond. And so I took part in loads of studies. This image in the middle, this is actually my brain that was published in a paper because they tested lots of people, but they thought that my pattern of activation was so like spot on. They, rather than use an average, they used an example like my data. So I'm sure you can't quite tell, but that's actually my nose. That's like my head. And what they showed was they used two different methods, fMRI, which is this one, and MEG, which is the magnetic one I was telling about earlier. And they showed that this is a visual task, and my visual cortex is active in exactly the same way over both of them, which is like proof that the two methods are really measuring the same processes and the same things. There's a lot of convergence between those two methods. So that's me and my brain. This picture on the right, I wanted to tell you about another method which I took part a lot in, which is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. And what this involves is putting a magnet over your head. And when they turn the magnet on, the piece of brain that's underneath the magnet stops working temporarily, so they can give you temporary brain damage and see how you behave differently. And I took part in a lot of those studies. One thing, to make sure it's working, to make sure that they've got it on the right strength for you and your skull and your head, they test it out first by finding that motor cortex that I was telling you about. Here they find the bit that's for your hand. They can see that on an MRI scan. They find the bit for your hand and they zap it, and you start moving your hand, but you didn't choose to. Your hand just starts moving. So that proves it's strong enough. And then they'll pick other areas of your brain and knock them out and see how it affects your performance in a cognitive test. And in particular, the reason I wanted to show you that gentleman with aphasia is because they can do this. They can TMS the part of your brain that you use for speech and then make you unable to speak for a little while, or make it harder for you to process language for a little while, so they can see how that affects your performance on a range of tests. So I got involved in all of this. Wherever you could sign up for something, I was signing up, trying to get all this experience because I was just passionate about this topic and I really wanted to do it. Also, you usually get paid some amount of money for participating in research, and that didn't hurt either. I was still a single mum at this point, trying to follow my dreams. Another benefit of doing a PhD is that sometimes they send you abroad to go to conferences, and I can't tell you how thrilled I was when I learned this. Like my upbringing, where I'm from, single mum from a council estate with all these things going on. I've been homeless, I've lived in these refuges, and now someone's going to pay for me to go to California, all expenses included, so I can go and talk about science, which is my favorite thing anyway. It was just unbelievable. And since then I've been many times, and it's never quite as shocking as the first time, but I'm still very, very lucky to be able to go to these things. So these conferences can be huge. One of them I go to is called the Society for Neuroscience annual meeting, and there's literally like 30,000 people go to this conference. They use a conference center which is half a mile long in New Orleans sometimes for it. That's how big it is. And all of us who go there make a poster like you can see in this picture, and the poster summarizes what research we've been doing, what the results are. I'll have graphs and diagrams of what we've been doing, and we stand around our poster and we wait for someone to be interested and ask us about it, and we can talk to them about what we've been up to. It's actually really fun, and it's a really good place to meet colleagues and start collaborations and discuss ongoing research. So those are joyful. Okay, so I finished my PhD. I got my undergraduate degree. You can put a tick on that big one, and then there's some people that get an undergraduate degree manage to go on to doing a PhD. So I'd managed that. That was great. And I'd graduated, and then I needed to get a job. And unfortunately, there's more people that want to be scientists than there are jobs for scientists. And so there's like an attrition along the way. And you kind of need to find the right job, because I developed skills in brain imaging and in EEG. And I was interested in memory. My PhD had been on the topic of memory. So I needed to find a really compatible job that was going to be around the same kind of thing. And I found a perfect job. It had a world leader in the neuroscience of memory. It was perfect for me, but it was in Dallas, Texas. So then I moved to Texas with my son. My son was 10 at this age, at this time in my life. And I worked for a lab studying memory. I learned how to do fMRI analyses, which is much more complicated, but very useful. And it's one of those things where you're like, I'm doing it. The thing I always said I wanted to do, I'm actually doing it. And there I studied memory declines in older age. So this lab was particularly focused, well, it's focused on typical memory. So just young people like your age, and how memory functions in you guys, and then you would compare that to older people, maybe in their 60s and 70s, and try to look at what changes over that time and why memory seems to fail as people get older. So we lived in Texas for a little while, but one thing about academic jobs like this one, research jobs, is they're often quite short. So they're not too short, but they are time limited. So you might get a job that lasts 3 years or 2 years. So you're always having to worry about what's going to happen when this job ends and how you're going to get on to the next one. And after a while, I'd been in Texas for 5 years, and it was time to move back to the UK. And so I started looking for jobs there, and I managed to get a job at the UCL, Great Ormond Street Institute for Child Health, where I got to work with patients with brain damage that were at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And I'm interested in memory, so I went to work for a lab that was working with children with memory impairments. So these children would come in for a clinical assessment with the doctors, but if they had a specific profile, they might get flagged by us for somebody that might want to take part in research as well. I learned to run neuropsychological assessments. I met a lot of patients and their families. I helped writing reports. So once you've done an assessment of a child, you have to write it all up and make sure that their notes are all ready. But as a scientist, I also got to design experiments that I could use with these children. And best of all, I got to design some interventions that really helped those children and made their lives better, made it better able for them to cope in school and to learn more. And although I'll never be able to remove the fact that they have this injury, we might be able to help them make the most out of what they have. So it's a very rewarding piece of work when you get to work with patients like this. Another thing, when I got this job at UCL, the first day I walked in and I met my new boss, her name was Professor Farineh Vagar-Kadem, and she had a massive poster on her wall of that same book I showed you at the beginning, Mapping the Mind by Rita Carter. And I was like, oh my gosh, I made it, I'm here. So again, these were short-term jobs. So after a few years, it's time to look for another job. And then that's when I moved into London South Bank University, but I'll get to that in a second. I was saying that I work with children with memory disorders, and I just wanted to mention that these children have damage to a brain region that's called the hippocampus. That brain region is really important for memory. Usually the damage happens when they're born, so they might get asphyxia, birth asphyxia, like get stuck in the birth canal, or there's a thing called meconium aspiration, where the child basically breathes in its first poo as it's being born, and it's very sticky and it clogs the lungs, and it's really bad for the child. So any lack of oxygen to the brain can cause this. And then these children just have no memory of their lives at all, but they appear perfectly normal because you can't tell if a baby doesn't remember what happened yesterday. And as they get to be a bit older, if a 3-year-old doesn't remember what you did yesterday, you don't worry that there's something wrong with their brain. They're just 3 years old. If you ask a child to go upstairs and fetch you something and they don't, you just assume they weren't paying attention. You don't assume they've got a memory disorder. So it actually takes a while for the memory disorder to be very noticeable, and then the child to get support. They're usually not diagnosed until much later. And the children don't really mind it either, because it's just normal for them. It's how they've always been. But as they get older and they need to study for exams, they want to live independently, it starts to become obvious that they're going to struggle to live independently because of the damage that they have. When working with children, it's nice to do outreach programs and make sure the children understand what you're doing and why. And I got to be involved in this really lovely theatre project for children called Jude Starbeam and the Mind Mission. But I know I can't play it because there won't be any sound. Well, I can play it, but there won't be any sound, so I'll just talk over it. These two are professional actors. This person on the left actually works for the Royal Shakespeare Company. And so they put on this amazing show about brain injury, and they got this grant from the Wellcome Trust to do it. But they wanted an actual brain scientist to be involved. So that's me beaming onto the spaceship so I can help them with this brain injury problem that they have on the ship. And it was just very fun to do. Another joy of being involved in research is when you get to do these outreach programs. They're really fun. Okay, so then I moved to London South Bank University and I became a lecturer. Now, as a lecturer, unfortunately, that's the wrong word. As a lecturer, you can't just do research. You can't spend all your time in the lab. You also have to do other things. There's 3 parts to being a lecturer. The first part is your research. You still need to produce research. That's part of your job, an important part. But you'd spend a lot of your time teaching, spending time with students, lecturing, giving seminars. And the third part is citizenship. You work with the university doing outreach events or doing working towards the university's goals as well. So that's what I do now. In terms of research, there's lots that I'm doing. These are 3 recruitment posters that I've just brought to show you. I'm still looking to intervene and support children that have brain injury. I also do EEG studies, so I'm still looking at how the brain supports memory. And I'm doing another study with adolescents because I have a patient who's an adolescent that I've got data for, and I'm looking for healthy controls. So I'm still doing all this brain science, neuropsychology research. I'm just doing it now based at London South Bank University. In terms of teaching, you probably all already know that at university you have large classes. Sometimes there can be 200 in a class, and you sit in these big lecture theatres. So that's part of my job. I give lectures, but I also plan a lot of seminars, small group activities. I like to think about issues that will really help drive a big debate and get the class all talking about these issues. I support students with their research. So I meet students who are in the same position I was in, single mums wondering what they're doing, but interested in something, and I get to support them and help them develop on their journey. And all through the teaching, we want to embed skills that would help everyone in the workplace. So most people don't go on to be research scientists. They go on to work in all kinds of different fields. And we want to make sure that everybody leaves us absolutely skilled to thrive in whatever they go on to do next. So we've got lots of employability embedded. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And in terms of citizenship, that's the third thing I do. So these are our LSBU values: excellence, professionalism, integrity, inclusivity, and creativity. And we all should be working towards those goals all the time. And part of my citizenship work is that I'm helping the university with its diversity and inclusion policies. And I'm working on the race equality charter to make sure that everyone that studies at LSBU or works at LSBU feels very welcomed and accepted, irrespective of their nationality, their religion, anything else. So that's the citizenship work that I'm doing, and that's very valuable work too. So I'm the course director of our BSc Psychology with Child Development, and so I've just started our new child development lab. We're just decorating that now, getting in lots of toys and comfy things for the children to work with, and bringing in all those tests that I learned to use at Great Ormond Street Hospital that are really good for assessing development in children. So what's it like to study at LSBU? Well, if you study psychology at LSBU or anywhere, you'll have to cover these core topic areas. They're not decided by us, they're decided by the British Psychological Society. And after your degree, in order to be recognised as a psychologist and registered with them, you should have to have studied all of these different things. So everyone does the core stuff all together, which are listed there in that diagram. Those are the required things. But then there are different specialisms as well. So at Southbank, we have forensic psychology if you're interested in criminal behaviour. We have clinical psychology for if you're interested in mental health and well-being. We have criminology, which is, again, to do with crime and criminal psychology. And then child development's my specialism, where you look at development across the lifespan. And yeah, as I was saying, we embed skills into all of it. So across your degree, you'd learn digital skills, numeracy, there's communication skills. You're assessed always on your critical thinking, analytical thinking. You have to do a lot of collaborative learning. There'll be group work as well as independent work. We'll put you into roles where you'll have to sometimes show leadership qualities, and you'll be shown how to gain confidence in leadership roles, because everyone's a bit unsure at the beginning, but with practice, everything becomes easier. And we also want to build resilience. So when things change, when you have to learn a new skill, you've been here before, you know how to learn new skills and take on new challenges, and you're ready for whatever gets thrown at you in the workplace. We also have a lot of links with employers and with different sectors. So whatever you're interested in, there's lots of different ways that you can get work experience and get involved, because work experience is an important part as well. Now, in terms of careers in psychology, there's lots of different careers. I've put a screenshot here of jobsinpsychology.co.uk, which is run by the British Psychological Society. And there's jobs there in clinical psychology, educational psychology, forensic psychology, health psychology. You can see this list at the bottom. There's so many different things. But lots of our psychology graduates actually go into marketing, go into HR, go into all kinds of different things, because at the end of the day, it's a very broad topic. You learn about people, you learn about maths and numbers, you learn how to communicate. There's lots and lots and lots you can do at the end of that. And I've said here, it's okay if you don't know what you want to do. I started this journey going, I want to study the brain. I'm just like blinkered in that direction, but you definitely don't have to feel that way. Lots of my students and lots of the people that I studied with through my education had no idea what they wanted to do, but they gained skills, they gained knowledge, and then they found what they wanted to do along the way. So that's fine. So I think that's all my slides. If anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And I've put my email address there if anybody wants to get in touch. So that's me.
I was on mute as usual, but yeah, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear your journey, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people on the call that would have learned a lot about the different things that you've done that perhaps is something they could do. I'll give some time for questions. There is one that's come in already, so I'll read that out to you. And it's someone who's very keen, I think, from hearing about your research. Good. And it says, can we take part in your experiments?
Now, I'm not going to lie, when I put those posters in, I was kind of hoping somebody's going to ask that. Yes, we're always recruiting. Send me an email. I don't know how old you are or what your deal is, but there'll probably be a study for you. So be in touch. And if there isn't one right now, there will be one soon. So yes, please, you're very welcome to participate in my research.
Amazing. I've just popped your details back on the screen there for everyone to have a look, and just let you know, so I did share the links to both the aphasia and your outreach video in the chat.
Oh, thanks.
We'll give it one more minute in case there are any more questions, but I have a question for you that I've asked all of our academics this week, just while we're waiting to see if there are any more, and that is, what would you say, obviously you've done a lot in your career, but as it is Careers Week, what would you say is the highlight for you of your career so far?
Oh my gosh, that's really hard. Well, there's two, because I can't pick. I think the first highlight would be the first time I got sent to California, because I still just can't believe someone sent me to California to do science. So that was definitely a highlight. But work-wise, it has to be working closely with the patients at Great Ormond Street, because they are just so phenomenal. And I've spent decades reading about these patients in books. Decades, and to actually be sat across from them and discussing their experience with them and just being completely blown away. So one of these patients with the same memory disorder I was saying, he remembers nothing from his life. Like, he has no recollection of any event in his life. He knows facts though, so he'll tell you, he knows where he lives, he knows he's married, he knows his address. But if you ask, what did you do yesterday, or what was your wedding day like, he doesn't know. He doesn't remember any events. But he reads a lot of books, and he was reading the Game of Thrones books. And I said, I can't read those because I always forget who's who. And I have to go back and read it over so many times, or ask my husband, because I just can't keep it all in my mind. So how do you manage? Do you keep having to go back and read over it and over it? And he said, no, I might as well skip forward, because when I get to the end, I wouldn't remember this part anyway. And then he said, I'm just not as bound in time as you are. And I was like, whoa, but it's true. If you don't have a memory, you don't have a sense of yourself in time. So he's like a time traveler who just arrives in moments and experiences them and just moves to the next moment. And I'm sat across from him like I'm talking to an oracle, like I'm talking to. So these moments when I'm talking to those patients, I think those have to be the highlights of my career.
Definitely, that sounds amazing. Thanks for sharing. A question we do have, somebody's probably thinking about their next step if they're already studying, or perhaps thinking just really far ahead, because you did mention that you did a PhD.
Yeah.
It says, how do you fund the PhD?
Good question. And I think it's changing. So when I did my PhD, the department that I was in would occasionally advertise them. There's a website called jobs.ac.uk, if you want to put that in the chat, which lists PhD studentships. So you can see the PhDs that are on there and apply to them. My department advertised some. Many universities will be advertising PhD studentships every year, and then people go ahead and apply and then are selected. And if it works like that, they've advertised the position. That means they've got grant funding for the position, and they'll be able to pay you what's called a stipend, which is kind of like a salary, but not quite, because it's not taxable. It's like a living expense gift rather than a salary. And you can use that to survive while studying. And they also pay your fees, so you don't have to pay tuition fees, because it's very competitive. Once you're on it, once you've applied and it's been successful and gone on it, then those things will be covered. But I'm finding more and more that students are being asked to teach to support their PhDs. So I think that what happens a lot more now is that students, rather than getting a stipend that covers everything, they pick up part-time like seminar support and teaching that covers their income, and then they kind of do the PhD around that. Which I think is a bit sad, because I think I got to spend 4 years dedicated on my research, and I loved that opportunity. And it would be a shame if people had to split it with part-time work just to cover it. I think it's a shame. And I also think that PhD students do a lot of really important work, like science happens because of people who are in the lab doing the work, and often that's a PhD student. So it's a shame that they're not getting the paid. But they are still getting paid. I just think sometimes they're expected to work as well.
Sure. Well, lovely. Thank you for letting us know, because it's good for people to hear about, perhaps where they might go after they've done the degree, or if they're perhaps really studying a master's, what their next step might be. And that's all the questions for now. We are just a bit over time, so I think we'll call it there for today. So thank you so much, Rachel, for coming along.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for sharing your journey with us, and thanks those on the call for attending and for your questions. And obviously you just see Rachel's details there, but if you do have any more and you missed them, our team outreach email is outreach@lsbu.ac.uk, and we're happy to put you in contact with Rachel. So yeah, thanks for attending. Do check out the website for information on open days if you'd like to come and see some of us in person, and have a lovely evening and weekend. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.